quite frankly, I don't know if billionaires need more help with free media coverage and public relations. So I think what the public really needs is more critical and more in-depth coverage of the ideologies and the approaches behind their kinds of philanthropy, the billionaire pledges and so on, how they're being rolled out in practice, where the funding's actually going and so on.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists, working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast was recorded and edited on Gadigal land. Large philanthropic endeavors and donations often make headlines, particularly ones that pledge weighty sums to conservation or climate issues. But are they actually making a difference? How is their effectiveness tracked? And how can journalists better cover them? Well, today's episode on the newscast examines this very subject. I'm joined in this conversation by Jonas, the global coordinator for the ICCA Consortium, and Michael Kavate, a staff writer for the news outlet Inside Philanthropy. The following is a fascinating examination of some considerations behind philanthropy coverage in the news, such as the intersectionality of human rights with environmental protection, whether or how funds take this into consideration, and the ethical questions behind westernized models and what they do or don't achieve. All of this is discussed on the episode. Whether you're a journalist or a curious listener who wants to learn more about this topic, we hope you find the discussion insightful. So, pretty simple question, but an important one. What are the biggest stories in conservation philanthropy right now? There's the Protecting Our Planet challenge, but are there other stories that you think journalists should really be focusing in on?
I'm happy to jump in, and I'll go through this in no particular order. I think there's an argument that many of these can be the most important, but billionaires coming into a dominant funding role throughout environmental philanthropy. A lot of that's around climate, but that also relates to conservation, as those are inextricably intertwined. And then Protecting Our Planet challenge, like Mike mentioned, there's just this proliferation of pledges of all sorts. And I think some of those relate to conservation directly or explicitly, and some indirectly. And that's a complex nest of different numbers and lengths to untwine. Then you've got this expanding number of intermediaries, both within traditional funding regions like the US and Europe, and then within kind of most of the rest of the world, particularly Latin America, Africa, but really everywhere across the world. And you have new intermediaries, you have long-time operators, and that's just another complexity of this field. And that, again, extends beyond, so many of these themes extend beyond conservation philanthropy into environmental philanthropy writ large, but they play out within both. And then a few more would be like indigenous-led protection has been a big topic within philanthropy, and a greater openness to funding and a greater recognition of the role that those communities have always played. Then, and we'll get into more of this later, so I'll just touch on it, but whether it's the broader localization or whether you call it DEI, JEDI, DJ, or just simply racial equity, those questions are reverberating, particularly in the US, throughout society, throughout philanthropy, throughout all of environmental philanthropy, and of course, also conservation.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Yeah, so maybe just to build on what Michael has shared. So I think it sometimes seems like the Protect Our Planet challenge is the biggest story because these are the big numbers, the big pledges, they grab the headlines, right? There's name recognition or brand recognition with the people behind these big pledges or their organizations behind the big pledges. But I think a lot of the time, the coverage maybe doesn't go very far beyond the initial numbers of those pledges, how much X or Y has pledged per se. And quite frankly, I don't know if billionaires need more help with free media coverage and public relations. So I think what the public really needs is more critical and more in-depth coverage of the ideologies and the approaches behind their kinds of philanthropy, the billionaire pledges and so on, how they're being rolled out in practice, where the funding's actually going and so on, which I'm sure we'll get into in this conversation today. So definitely digging much more deeply into those pledges, I think is something that we need in journalism right now. And as Michael said, I think there's a huge proliferation in a really positive way of a whole range of other kinds of funding mechanisms. And those tend to be much more closely linked to, if not directly embedded within, the communities they seek to serve, whether that's Indigenous-led funds, feminist funds, environmental justice ones, Black-led funds, and so on. So especially as part of solutions journalism, which is really gaining steam, I think, including within Mongabay, those kinds of values and more grassroots embedded approaches, I think, deserve more of the spotlight and attention than maybe what they're getting at the moment, kind of in the shadow of the big billionaire pledges. So I'd love to see more coverage of Indigenous-led funds, of grassroots funds, region-specific funds, and so on, that are much closer to the ground and to the communities that they're seeking to serve. As Michael mentioned as well, sometimes this perceived line between climate philanthropy or climate funding and biodiversity or conservation funding. In practice, of course, climate and biodiversity issues are extremely intertwined. So I just wanted to underline that point from Michael. And also I would add to that, there is not a clear line at all between environmental and human rights or social justice issues. So again, I think when you have a funder or a philanthropist saying, oh, we are funding climate issues only, oh, not that human rights thing over there, I would definitely question that and dig deeper into, again, what is their ideology? What are the biases and values that they might be coming into the picture with that perhaps need to be deconstructed and changed so that they are really tackling the issues, the systemic and structural injustices and issues that really need to be addressed in an integrated manner.
Thanks for sharing, Holly. So we started to get into some of the more critical questions that we want to be asking, but let's dive right into it. So what are some more critical questions that you think reporters should be investigating? Like Holly, you just mentioned, where is the line towards human rights protection rather than just biodiversity protection or just climate protection? So what are some of more critical questions that you both think journalists really need to be honing in on?
Sure. I think that one thing that came up as Holly was speaking was when you get more specifically into conservation philanthropy, you have this question of what is its place in a world that funders are finally seeing the intersectional reality that we all live in. That's more and more kind of common to be voiced and to be acknowledged and to attempt to adjust in funding. And not that people haven't always known that, but it hasn't always shown in the funding, and it's been more a la carte and isolated. And I think working out kind of for a reporter of how to address that question in their coverage of these stories is important. You also have, I think it's that simple request, like who makes the decisions? Where is the money going? Over what timeline? These very basic reporting questions that are true for anything are really come back again and again on how I approach at least covering conservation philanthropy or any other type of environmental philanthropy. And it's that classic line of follow the money and figure out who has power and talk to people who both have power and don't have power, and you'll get a richer story.
Yeah, so I would pick up on that again. And so in addition to follow the money, I think the other key question, which is very, very closely linked, is follow the power. So follow the money and follow the power in funding for climate conservation and so on. And so if we're looking specifically within the funding piece, I would say the funding and the power, follow the money, follow the power are kind of two sides of the same coin, no pun intended. So we could look at perhaps three broad questions if we're investigating follow the money piece in particular. So where is the funding coming from? Who is making decisions about how it should be used and by whom? And then what are the nuts and bolts of the funding itself? How is it being used? So maybe just to elaborate briefly on those 3 points. So if we look at where the funding is coming from, there are lots of different ways that philanthropy can be structured, let's say, kind of administrative homes for that, which in itself, there are some questions around transparency and accountability, depending on that setup. A key concern, I would say, among a lot of movements and grassroots organizations as well, is that a lot, if not all, philanthropic wealth at some point comes from the very same extractive industries that really underpin our planetary crises. So if we're looking at maybe private or family foundation that's really seeking to fund conservation and climate action, a key question, I would say, is are they also actively divesting from these harmful industries, or are they perhaps actively or passively upholding the status quo? Some even might be actively opposing eliminating subsidies, for example, for fossil fuels and other harmful industries. Are they backing the organizations that are really addressing systemic injustices, or are they going for kind of status quo, don't rock the boat approaches? What proportion of their profits are they directing towards philanthropy, and how much are they dispersing each year? Are they directing as much of their wealth as possible to addressing the crises that we have now, or are they only dispersing the minimum required by federal law, particularly in the US? So those are some of the questions we could look into in that first bundle of where is the funding coming from. Within the second one, who is making decisions about how the funding should be used and by whom? Again, something we both mentioned already is, are the people from the communities and the movements actually involved in those decisions? Or perhaps is it just someone who happens to have a lot of money and privilege and thinks that because of that, they know how to address their particular pet cause, whatever that might be? There's a lot of questions around how decisions are made around what is being funded, and are, particularly in the case of billionaire pledges and their foundations, are they basically acting like a proxy government and determining policy agendas when perhaps that's not their role in society? Question. And then the third main question around what are the nuts and bolts of the funding itself? An obvious one, Michael already mentioned intermediaries. So that in itself is a broad range. It can go from very, very big mainstream organizations to quite small and locally grounded organizations. It is a very broad camp of intermediaries, so to speak, to the extent that I think that word may not be super relevant or as nuanced as we may need it to be. So again, a key question, how many organizational hands is the funding passing through before it finally gets to where it's intended to go or to the level it's seeking to support? For large organizations in particular that are seen as usually trusted hands with quote unquote absorptive capacity administratively, are there sufficient checks and balances for those, what is typically power imbalances in how they're structured and how they make decisions and so on? For small and local organizations in particular, is the funding in the form of flexible core support with minimal administrative burden? So trust-based philanthropy, which is really growing in a really positive way, in certain ways at least. Or perhaps does the funding or do the funders really impose their own priorities or have very, very high administrative burden with huge applications, strict work plans, huge reports, and so on, to the extent that organizations are doing more to kind of address the funders' demands and getting on with the work that they're seeking to support. So these are just some of the many questions that perhaps could be looked into further within that bundle of follow the money. Where is the funding coming from? Who's making decisions? And what are the nuts and bolts of the funding itself?
Those were all excellent points. I hope everyone was taking notes there. I know I'll be going back and reviewing that. Michael, did you have anything to add to that?
I think Holly did an excellent job of summing it up. It's kind of that step-by-step process and then digging in at each point, and likewise might come back to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And Holly, I hate to ask you for more, but from your perspective, what are some areas of coverage you think journalists are currently missing right now in the media conversation on philanthropy? What do you think journalists are missing right now?
Well, I really support journalism in general, so I don't want to be critiquing journalists who I know work very, very hard under very challenging circumstances. But I do think just those two headline topics, follow the money, follow the power, are really, you can't really go wrong with those, I would say. It's all about in the public interest. What are the questions that need to be asked in order to get closer to transparency and accountability, holding people in power to account, really, and delving into that further in every possible way. Michael has reported brilliantly on this before with lots of different coverage that he's done. But something we talked about last week is when you have these big pledges or even medium-sized pledges, frankly, it's not usually clear if, or rather how it's being counted. So is it just part of their existing programmatic priorities? Is it new and additional funding? Are they double counting it between pledges? Things like that. So I think there are just so many different directions that one could take to just, again, follow the money, follow the power, regardless of what aspect of it you're looking into. And then, as we mentioned in the first question, I think there's just so many really exciting initiatives, Indigenous-led funds, feminist funds, and so on, that hardly get any attention whatsoever. And there's so many stories that are just waiting to be shared from very, very grassroots levels all the way up to totally global level movements. And those are the ones that really deserve a lot more attention. I think they are doing brilliant work in general, but also it's part of further supporting the development of those different approaches to philanthropy, more solidarity-based, more network-based, movement-based approaches to philanthropy that I think deserve more attention. And I know I'm coming from a nonprofit side, but more support in general, but, good coverage and fair, transparent coverage is part of that, building that infrastructure.
Yeah, I would add just simply that one lens I often use when I'm trying to evaluate a big swath of grants from one of these pledges is some very simple ones of like, where are these organizations based? Are they based in the country that they're trying to affect, let alone the community? Because sometimes that's at the scale of where we're talking about. You also have questions of, what were the previous budgets of these organizations? How high profile are they? Who are their leadership? Did the leadership come from the foundations themselves? Are they part of the community that they're attempting to support? Are they part of the nation that they're attempting to support? And as you delve into that, it's one quick way of kind of sorting out. And I'll often make a spreadsheet. I'll add up. If you look at it may be an overwhelming list of grants, but if you look at the major grants, you can get a pretty good sense of a funder or a pledge's dominant themes, because frankly, a bulk of the funding ends up typically going to a few organizations. And that tells you the story of that pledge in a very effective way. And it is often a different story than I find the language of those pledges will tell, or the language of the announcement will tell, or the organizations that they focus on. And so doing your own analysis of it, for me, is essential in order to kind of validate what the numbers say versus what the press release how it might put it.
If I can maybe add to that as well, I think something that some Indigenous colleagues have also said is needed in the context of these big pledges is a kind of a counterpart check and balance from the communities that are apparently receiving funding, as in the big press releases or the major conservation organizations that say they're directing X percent or X amount to communities. So for communities themselves, Indigenous organizations, networks, etc., also to be tracking and reporting and providing that check and balance of what they're actually receiving. And I'm not saying there will be necessarily a gap there, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a gap between what funders and or the larger organizations receiving the bulk of it, what they say they're redistributing or sharing with communities on the ground or national organizations and what they're actually receiving. So having additional forms of reporting from the folks who are purportedly receiving it also perhaps is another source of information for that, again, transparency piece. Beyond the self-reporting of funders and big organizations who it's in their best interest to kind of make themselves look good, frankly.
All excellent points. Thank you both. That was a great list of some topics that reporters should also keep in mind. Michael, what are some tools that you use to investigate philanthropy that you think other reporters should be using?
Yeah, it's a varied list, and it depends on the assignment or the topic. I'll go through it in no particular order again, but I'm lucky to work for an organization that has a subscription to Candid and the Foundation Center. And while I think everybody who's worked in philanthropy or experienced philanthropy can say that is a very incomplete database, it's also the very best we have. I respect utterly the challenge that they face in trying to gather all this grants data and process it in a way that makes some sense. And it's kind of a rough guide, if you will. It's not definitive, but it's again, the most comprehensive, publicly available data, albeit paid. ClimateWorks has a lot of data that's of high value, obviously in a climate sense, but that crosses into conservation, as we touched on. So there are various reports. I think they're one of the more well-resourced outfits tracking these things. I've written about the various third-party efforts, and that's like, you have a huge range there from Giving USA to governmental tracking organizations to new kind of AI or algorithmic-based tracking to members-only things like the Environmental Grant Makers Association in the US, and then their European counterparts have some degree of tracking. And so far, I've just been focusing on the numbers side of this and just working out how much money is flowing and where. But if you're diving into a particular philanthropy in the US, I strongly recommend learning how to read a 990. I did this by simply Googling guides and reading all of them, and then ultimately finding and connecting and building relationships with experts who could answer kind of my more particular and unique questions. And then I do think if all of this is new to you, I would say that the kind of classic journalistic tool of just talking to as many people as possible will only serve you. That's obvious advice, but by asking people where they get their data and asking them about these stories, you'll just keep adding to your list of experts, your list of resources, etc. And then obviously there's the Google searches. There's things like the nonprofit, ProPublica's Nonprofit Explorer, which allows you to search people and by keywords. And so you can, again, if you're looking at within the US, you can kind of pull up persons of interest, etc. And it's a plug, but if you happen to be an Inside Philanthropy subscriber, we have, it's not me, but it's a whole bunch of other people do a whole database as well. And that's something else you can use. I also frequently go to the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I'll search their website and see what they've written. I think searching up all the possible stories that have been written, that's where I get a lot of my information and context and history, because these things have been often written about for ages, and knowing that history, just as with any reporting, is so valuable to covering it accurately and comprehensively.
Thanks for sharing, Michael. Holly, actually, did you have any to add or any databases that you wanted to share as well?
No, I think Michael's done a great job with that one.
All right, we're going to move on to our next topic here. So just for some context here, critics of biodiversity pledges and philanthropy, they say that many of these pledges, they can entrench fortress conservation, which is a concept which we can explain more in detail. But Holly, you've spoken with Mongabay about this before and how funds are typically funneled to large conservation organizations with brand recognition. So you said to Mongabay, quote, "What needs to happen is actually the opposite, more localization and more diversification, including to indigenous-led funds and movement-based organizations with actual grassroots legitimacy and accountability." So what are some examples where you think localization of funding with robust accountability was achieved?
So I can speak to some examples. I can't comment on to what extent they have robust accountability per se. I haven't investigated that myself, but that would be a great question for journalists around the table here. But yeah, I think there's a lot of debate these days, which is really good. There's been debate for many years, of course, but more mainstream debate about what is conservation and who does conservation and conservation for whom and for what purposes, etc. So I think the typical kind of not barriers, but the typical kind of definition of conservation has evolved a lot and changed a lot in the past few years in particular, especially with advocacy around the new global biodiversity framework when that was being negotiated in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Lots of organizations and indigenous networks and so on were advocating for something that we've been referring to as the third pathway. So in the main target on area-based conservation, this the 30 by 30, the kind of infamous 30 by 30 target. A lot of people think that's only referring to protected areas, but it also includes this other thing called other effective area-based conservation measures and indigenous and traditional territories. And this third pathway is very intentionally there in order to underscore there are many different ways in which indigenous peoples, local communities, lands and territories and resources might be recognized. And they may choose to have that recognized in a kind of typical protected areas framework nationally. They may not for many, many reasons, which I'm sure a lot of folks here know. So I think that also links to biodiversity funding or conservation funding. So of course, we're going to have a lot of funding, probably the vast majority will continue to go to mainstream status quo approaches, which very unfortunately, and since the start of modern conservation, has been very tightly linked with a lot of human rights violations and injustices, building on centuries of oppression, attempted genocide of indigenous peoples, and so on. And this continues to this day. This is not something that happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, post-independence from the British Empire and so on and so forth. This is very much still happening today, unfortunately. And it's ramping up in some places as we have this more and more kind of competition, let's say, for natural resources, for physical space for people to live within with dignity. And a lot of folks who are most closely linked to lands and resources are indigenous peoples whose entire identities, cultures, and ways of life are inherently linked to where they are with their territories. So when we have increasingly militarized approaches to conservation, that is going to come into conflict more and more, even more so. And we also have examples such as in Tanzania, for example, with Loliondo. Some of you might be familiar with the violent forced eviction of a number of Maasai pastoralists from that area in Tanzania. In some ways, it was reported as in the name of conservation. Government said no, or government said, yes, it's for conservation. Of course, we need to take care of our environment, thinking this was going to be a good thing in some quarters. But also, when you look into the funding behind that, apparently it's largely funded by a royal family in the Gulf, for example. And there are very, very tight linkages between very, very wealthy families from different parts of the world working closely with government officials in countries, again, around the world to secure land, resources, access, etc., for their own personal gain, basically, not in the public interest at all. And so I just encourage you, especially because in that particular situation in Tanzania, there was a huge crackdown on journalism and freedom of speech. And so the narrative that was coming out was only the narrative from the government, may or may not have been reflective of what was actually happening on the ground. So I totally appreciate it's extremely difficult circumstances and context to do proper journalism, but try to be creative around that and see, is this narrative that's out there actually what's happening, or is there something else happening? Now, to come back, sorry, that was not directly responding to your question, Mike, but coming to that now, I think it's also linked to, again, what constitutes conservation action or climate action and who is doing that work. So again, when we look at actions such as defending the environment, defending territories, defending human rights defenders, that comes in many different forms. I was just speaking earlier today, actually, with two amazing organizations, Natural Justice in Africa and the Environmental Defenders Collaborative, which is a pooled fund that very specifically supports actions, preventative and emergency in nature for environmental and human rights defenders. So their work in rapid response and preventative response for environmental defense is very much contributing to conservation, but we might not think in a mainstream way, oh, that's conservation funding per se, but it absolutely is necessary. Similarly, we have other forms of support, strategic litigation to defend against oil exploration, for example, or mining in a particular territory or in a protected area as well. Having support for that kind of strategic litigation is absolutely supporting conservation and climate action. We might not think of that necessarily as conservation funding, but it is contributing to it. There are also other kinds of funds that are supporting communities with customary and traditional livelihoods, for example. So supporting them to stay in their territories and support younger generations to learn their knowledge systems, to learn their food production systems, for example, their languages, their cultures, their traditions, that will enable them to continue sustaining the diversity of life within their territories and far beyond. So support for that kind of work, again, may not be obviously conservation funding, but it is absolutely contributing to conservation outcomes. Cultural Survival has a couple of great small funding mechanisms. Keepers of the Earth Fund have another one for small grants for community media. There's the AYNI Fund, AYNI Fund, again, really led by Indigenous values and worldviews, smaller grants directly to community organizations. They're doing amazing, amazing work around the world that definitely would be great to further support. I know Mongabay has covered a new fund, the Nusantara Fund in Indonesia, for example. There's other kind of Asia-wide funds. There's different country-specific funds in Latin America, like the Podali Fund in Brazil. Again, another Indigenous-led fund that's really taking off and really doing fantastic work at a very localized or national level. So there's so many examples. There's hundreds and hundreds of these funds out there. Maybe just to mention as well as a potential source of information for journalists, the International Fund for Indigenous Peoples has a working group on Indigenous-led funds. And I believe there's 40 plus funds that they're now working with very actively. So there's lots of amazing ones out there across all different regions for issue-specific funds as well.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Holly. Michael, do you have any thoughts or comments that you wanted to share about this topic?
Yeah, as someone who I still feel quite new to conservation philanthropy and to covering environmental philanthropy overall, I started 3.5, nearly 4 years ago. And I see the questions around fortress conservation kind of as an illustration of, or a reminder to question the current dogma. You talk to folks in conservation philanthropy and they'll say, we used to do conservation or fortress conservation. That was more common 10, 20 years ago. Obviously, some people in some ways still practice it today. Now you have a more climate-oriented conservation, a more, to certain degrees, more people-centered approaches. You also, coming back to kind of the Indigenous-led land protection funding that is increasingly available and common. That's something that's been around for ages, but is only starting to be accepted. So clearly, like these massive institutions that are literally kind of piles of money that get doled out each year, they have incredible expertise. They have some of the leading experts. They ignore some of the most long-running expertise that exists in our world, and they've taken utterly wrong paths that they now reject. So it's a reminder. We can all say this about ourselves, right? What we did in the past was wrong, and maybe we've learned. And as we cover philanthropy, I think it's all kind of a metaphor for saying, is what's happening right now seeming to answer these questions? How much has it progressed from what we did before? And how much will we look back on it and see that it was misguided? And I attempt as someone who's new to kind of look back and look forward as I write and talk to people who have that experience and also that experience that's outside of those kind of traditional channels to help me look back and look forward, because everything I say today is basically someone with more experience and has taught me over this reporting time I've been in this beat. And so that's what this topic brings up for me, is that constant need to question the current mode of doing things and wonder if there's another way, and listen to the people who say, yeah, we should try this.
If I can just add a tiny bit more. So I think in addition to all that, really love that point, Michael. And I would say, again, another aspect of not obviously conservation funding would be funding for the communications work around that shift in the paradigm as well. So the stories that are typically told are the stories told by the big guys, the big conservation organizations that have huge media, PR, public relations teams, and so on. A lot of smaller organizations might have one lonely communications person, if that, and they're very, very overworked and so on. So I think there's also, again, as we kind of broaden our understanding of what counts as conservation funding or what conservation funding can and should be used for, I think backing communications, backing journalism itself actually is super important in turning the tide of what is the narrative, or what are the many narratives around what conservation is, or what it should be, or who should it be done by, so to speak. And what are the kinds of extremely diverse actions that are happening all around the world every single day that generally don't get a lot of attention, if anything, because all of the oxygen is taken up by the ones who can kind of pay for the big ad campaigns. So again, I think supporting communications around, the stories and the narratives that need to be rewritten or told by different people from different perspectives, that will also help turn that tide, perhaps at an even faster rate than it's been turning so far, shifting away from the very kind of old school, I would say outdated approaches to top-down exclusionary conservation, and ushering in really very actively a very people-centered, human rights-centered conservation that is fundamentally intertwined with social justice as well.
Great thoughts, both of you. And digging in a little deeper more now on how funding actually gets used. So a $1.7 billion pledge was agreed to at COP26. But critics have pointed out that Indigenous peoples only saw 7% of the funding that was allocated for Indigenous forest tenure. So that's quite a discrepancy. So given that, what should journalists be looking for when they're examining how specific funding gets used? What details should reporters be asking about to find out how the money is allocated for Indigenous land rights and how it's actually making its way to communities? Or isn't in this case?
Yeah, always such an important topic to be delved into. I think, I try to always, it's a classic point, but simply talk to the groups on the ground, talk to the folks who are the target population, the target groups that whatever funding pledge is trying to, and ask them how they're experiencing this funding and whether they're seeing anything. And that's a first step that should always be taken. I think when I look at this, the reason we know that percentage figure is that there's an internal evaluation. So there's questions of like, how will you be evaluating, as new pledges arise? Will there be a transparent reporting process? How will it be tracked? And who will be doing that tracking? You can also, I think you're always looking for third-party sources. I find this quite difficult within philanthropy because the universe of people who pay close attention to these things and who will comment on them publicly is relatively small, but obviously academics and to some extent, some consultants will be following this and be able to comment. But I think as we talked about with pledges earlier, there's this question of, does this pledge money build on what X institution granted last year or not? And then there's a question of like, who are your partners? Who is making this decision? If it's an Indigenous focused pledge, to what extent are Indigenous people involved in making the decision of where funding goes and so forth, whichever the focus of the pledge is. I'm also often looking for kind of a worthy comparison as something that will give a sense of it, because sometimes the numbers are there's limited data, there's limited disclosure, you can only go on other facts that might shine light on it. So I'm looking for studies or past processes that suggest the potential risks and then trying to investigate whether those things are occurring in this case. And I think it's also important to look for the nuance. I mean, one thing about the 7% figure is that there's also a certain amount of money that does flow through other organizations and reaches groups on the ground. And I think both reporting that and reporting like how much do we expect that, what percentage of that money do we expect to run through these organizations and be soaked up? How much overhead is reasonable? Because that is the question. We fundamentally, these larger philanthropies issue large multi-million-dollar grants, and they're often outsourcing the smaller grant making at a community level. And so one question is whether that falls with a group that's local to the community versus, say, a large international NGO. And the other question is like, how much actually flows from either of those types of organizations to the communities that are supposed to be the ultimate beneficiaries. So much to be delved into, and sometimes it depends on the pledge itself and the dynamics of it in particular. But I'll start there and let Holly take it from here.
Thanks, Michael. And yes, I hope folks have read Michael's great recent coverage of the 7% reporting and the Forest 10-year Funders Pledge and so on. If you haven't, I really recommend it. And so this thing, the Forest 10-year Funders Pledge, if you're not familiar with it, I would definitely encourage you to look into it further. I think things like this, so funder-led initiatives, are also really important. I'm not saying they have everything figured out at all. I'm not saying they have all the answers, but it's so important for within the funders groups also to have a space for peer learning and exchange, for honest debate and conversation and holding each other accountable. And I know it's maybe within a bubble in some cases, but there's a lot of really amazing people within the kind of more progressive funders, and they're super committed and they're very connected to grassroots and Indigenous organizations and so on. So I think we can also, help them help us in a way by also shining a spotlight on the kind of processes that funders themselves are initiating to do their own improvement also within the philanthropy ecosystem, I suppose. So the Forest 10-year Funders Pledge is a very interesting one. They are much more transparent, I would say, than others around the actual pledge. And they're putting out these annual reports. They've done 2 so far. They've also done things like, revising the figure that they reported the first time. They realized there was an accounting error, basically, or they counted things wrong. So they're being, again, I'm not saying they have everything sorted out, but they are being much more open than other pledges. And they are trying hard to have a way of both tracking and being public about the tracking and the transparency around that, which in itself opens up space for more transparency and accountability from others. It's almost the ones that share absolutely nothing publicly. They don't have a website. They don't disclose things. They have the most evasive possible administrative homes for their funding. Like those are the ones that really need a lot of attention as well. And the ones that are already giving us kind of a foot in the door, let's say, for that transparency. Let's keep pushing that door open and keep delving deeper into that. So yeah, we need leaders within the philanthropy system as well. And I do see some within the Forest Tenure Funders Pledge who are trying to kind of really advance the debate and the practice of this as well. Just on that, though, I would definitely say for climate funding, I know that one in particular is focused on forest tenure, but for climate funding, for conservation funding, and I hear this all the time from our members and other community networks, it's not just forests. There are so many other ecosystems that are critical for climate mitigation and adaptation and for conservation more broadly. I know tropical rainforests are kind of the most charismatic, let's say, obviously super important, but there's also a lot of attention needed for grasslands and rangelands, for boreal forests, for the Arctic, for oceans and coasts and mangroves and so on. So I think there's also a need for diversifying the coverage of these kinds of pledges and initiatives, and also pushing funders to diversify their focus as well, rather than just thinking, oh, we support climate, therefore it must be forests. There's a wide range of ecosystems and livelihood strategies that are contributing beyond forests in addition to forests, I guess. Another piece, picking up on Michael's point about the intermediaries and who's receiving what, I think this might be a bit cynical, but I think supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities might be seen as kind of a trend at the moment in conservation. And so, again, this sounds really cynical. You can tell I'm not just starting out in my career. But a lot of the big conservation organizations have very, very intentionally shifted their narratives about how they work and what they're working on and what they're supporting. I'm not saying it's not true, but I think there may be more of a PR spin to it than is the reality on the ground. And it may be more opportunistic than we might like in an ideal world. And again, kind of seeing how certain funders are pivoting in that direction. And they may be saying, oh, well, if we tweak this word in our application, or we say we're doing consultations here or there, then we will still be able to get the funding, even if within those institutions, perhaps it's not happening in the way that they maybe say it's happening. So I think if for journalists who are looking at different sources of information through Candid or otherwise, if you're looking at grant agreements, for example, or if you're looking at descriptions of a project or a grant that a conservation organization is receiving, just dig a little deeper or a lot deeper and go beyond the headline and look at what is the organizational culture within those big institutions, and look at the capacities within those big institutions to actually put into practice what they say they're going to do or what they say they're doing. Yeah, again, there are some great people in all these organizations. There's, it's not a black and white issue. That said, the bigger organizations tend to have less internal motivation to shake the boat or to rock the boat or to do things radically differently. They typically go for quite big sources of funding from quite wealthy individuals who also have their own biases and perspectives on what conservation is and how it should be done. So yeah, the bigger you go with the organization, the less progressive they're typically going to be, and the more inertia against radical change internally in their organizational cultures. So if you're looking for more progressive approaches, more progressive organizations, look for the medium, smaller size ones, and the ones where there is leadership through all levels of the organization that are really committed and have kind of personal proclivities towards social justice and human rights considerations. And it's not just something that's kind of said in a press release when it's good for them, but it's actually in their DNA as an organization. It's in their capacity within their teams. It's throughout the entire organization. And it's not just a kind of opportunistic public relations thing because it's the current trend. So I think delving a lot more into that and interrogating those narratives or the buzzwords that a lot of conservation organizations are now using, I think will help again with that transparency and accountability around this piece. Again, not saying that those groups are not doing good stuff. A lot of them are. But I think we need a healthy dose of critical thinking and a bit of cynicism to dig below the headlines, yeah?
Those are fantastic points, Holly. Thank you so much for sharing that. Before I move on to the last question we have, Michael, did you have any more thoughts that you wanted to add on to that?
I will jump in and say I would be remiss, and I apologize I didn't correct this earlier, but the reality is that the most recent report put the percentage at 2.1%, and they corrected that prior percentage downwards to 2.9%. And I think that's actually, to me, a huge mark of confidence in this type of mechanism, this open and transparent reporting, to see someone take a already kind of dire figure and show that it's lower than that. And this report, this Forest Tenure Funders Group report, serves exactly as that kind of comparison that I think you can bring to other pledgers and say, are you going to do something like this? Do you know this number? Do you know these percentages? That helps and kind of provide a funder or pledge group that exists that doesn't have this level of transparency. Example of, here, your peers are doing this. And kind of, I've seen in my limited time covering philanthropy that efforts like this, whether it's Green 2.0, and these are somewhat outside of the conservation space, but adjacent, Green 2.0 covering environmental philanthropy writ large and trying to get philanthropies along with their nonprofits to reveal the various demographics of their staff. Or you have things like the Climate Justice Funders Pledge that is trying to get people to commit to transparency around what percentage of their climate funding is going to BIPOC-led groups, and trying to get them to commit to sending at least 30%. These type of efforts give you a spotlight to shine on other organizations that aren't doing it that way, or note that they aren't participating in this, or that there is this other pledge with this report. And I think that kind of comparative work in this journalistic space is very helpful to show that there's a different way of doing things. And jumping a little bit sideways to another point that Holly made is absolutely the people who work for all levels, all types of foundations are often, they are more expert in this than me. They've been working in it longer. They're very well-meaning people. They're dedicating usually their lives to something that pays less than were they to work in industry, etc. And that also means that often they're pursuing the solutions that their lives have worked for them, the kind of approaches and change methods that the systems and structures that let them get to those kind of high-level positions are the same that they pursue. And so I think it's that just as we all have a limited aperture, or we're exposed and expert in what we know, and that too, philanthropy. I had an interviewee, philanthropist themselves, saying something like, grantmakers do not spring fully formed from the forehead of Zeus, a little reference to Greek mythology. And yeah, it's like there are these human actors pursuing answers in the way they best know how. And as journalists, I too have those exact same limitations, and I attempt to talk to as many people to try to widen that perspective, both for myself and for anyone who reads my coverage. That's the tool of journalism in any endeavor.
All right. Thank you both so much for the incredibly substantive answers that you've given on this webinar so far. With that said, I'm going to just touch on this last question here. We may not get into it too much, but I wanted to ask, what is PFP, or the Project Finance for Permanence? And what are the potential risks with this conservation funding model and other for-profit models like it, such as the Bloomberg Oceans Initiative?
Michael, do you want to go first? Do you want me to?
If you can go first, that's great. But if you prefer, I'll go.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. Then you can build on it. My patchy answer to come. So I think this is one of actually several quite interesting, potentially innovative approaches to finance more broadly. Again, it goes beyond, as in the name, Project Finance for Permanence. It goes beyond philanthropy per se. So beyond kind of private family philanthropy, it goes into different forms of finance more broadly. And another example I would say is debt for nature swaps, which again, super interesting, potentially very concerning in different ways. So I think these kinds of models or approaches or concepts definitely would benefit from, as in public interest, would benefit from further exploration of the details beyond the headlines, beyond the kind of big announcement of, oh, a new protected area with project finance for permanence backing from this organization and this funder. Really, again, to kind of come full circle to the first question, follow the money, follow the power. And so who is part of those decision-making processes, and what are the potential catalysts for change or for embedding status quo approaches that maybe, again, further entrenching systemic injustices or power imbalances, that may be further entrenching, elitism, excluding folks from the general public and from communities who are directly affected from those decision-making processes and so on. So yeah, in general, this project finance for permanence it's basically a combination of private and public funding through potentially a range of different financing models. And there is quite a diversity of them as well. There are some in my home country of Canada that have been pretty effective from my very limited understanding, working very, very closely with Indigenous nations in British Columbia, for example. There are some that are quite small in nature, relatively small, others that are huge, mega country level, many tens of millions of dollars worth. And again, just looking at, okay, who is brokering this basically? Who is proposing it? Who is brokering it? Who is calling the shots? Who's influencing? In what ways? Typically, it's a large conservation organization. I won't name names, but there are not that many large organizations that tend to broker these deals. And they have a lot of political capital, and they're able to have very high level meetings with presidents, prime ministers, etc. And they're able to be basically the middle people for these deals. And again, they may be able to get in certain progressive shifts in maybe the country's protected area system, for example. It could be an opportunity to advocate for, in different ways, more respect for Indigenous territories and rights and so on. On the other hand, it could also be just kind of status quo and further entrenching the typical approaches that, again, further social injustice rather than the other way around. So it just hugely depends on who's in the room, who's advocating for this, who's calling the shots, who has access and influence in different ways, and for what purpose, frankly. So in some cases, it might be leveraged for another decision or another form of influence. They might be seeking a particular business deal with the for-profit side of a company, for example, instead of just their foundation side. So yeah, definitely a lot of questions that need to be asked for more transparency there. And something, again, because it tends to be huge amounts of money and very closed door decision-making processes, there's not a lot of information shared publicly about how these things work. So I think there's a huge need for more in-depth reporting, very sensitive, nuanced reporting as well. And ideally from folks who are in the countries where these initiatives are happening. A lot of the time it tends to be organizations as well as funders from outside of those countries that are kind of coming in at quite a high level of government to influence, again, pretty high level decisions. Again, could be catalytic in a positive way, depending on who's there, what they're advocating for, could further entrench existing injustices.
Thank you so much, Holly, for that great summary. I'm glad you can offer a cogent kind of quick summary of permanence, but also that more in-depth and consideration of its potential boons and drawbacks. Since I haven't covered project finance for permanence specifically, I really feel like I don't understand it that well myself, but I will say that in reporting on this sector and its history, so much of the themes you raised up are how I approach this. There is fundamentally, whether it's conservation or climate writ large, there's this enormous pool of private capital, right? That's much bigger than what governments have to bring to the table. It's much bigger, certainly, than what philanthropy can. And there's this growing number of efforts in various ways, as you said, to tap that capital. And the question is, this falls into that category that I mentioned earlier of solutions that folks at elite institutions turn to because they are the kind of high level solutions that have worked for them or that they've seen work, but often have damaged or at least left behind folks who are not included in those conversations and shaping those choices. And that feels like such a fundamental element of both philanthropic and environmental action, and certainly conservation action of all sorts. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that Holly focused on these have potential to be huge tools and not. Sometimes there's a tendency, and I probably fall into myself, of bemoaning these efforts and wishing everything would happen kind of without these sort of structures or mechanisms. And yet, to some degree, these sort of arrangements will be needed. And it's about who is involved in shaping them and in what form do they take place. And historically, we know that the people with the least power have not been involved in making these kind of big, far-reaching agreements and decisions. And so whether or not philanthropy is pushing to bring those new decision makers, those ignored decision makers into the room, into the debate is a key question. And I'll emphasize that all those opinions are certainly not some opinion of my own, but just one that others have kind of like suffered under this very reality, have repeatedly cited and explained to me. But I'm excited for the potential of these. And I also think it's important to question how are they set up and in what manner is philanthropy engaging? Are they just trying to make them happen, or are they trying to make them happen in a different sort of way?
Mike, can I just add a little point? Sorry, I know we're kind of past the talkie time and I need to get to the question. I think another dimension of this, when we're looking at the kind of public-private finance for conservation purposes or climate action as well. Also, it's really important to zoom out and look at the broader kind of finance system in that particular country or kind of internationally. So when we're looking at, for example, the amounts of funding that countries are often seeking to support quote unquote conservation or climate action versus the amount that they're already subsidizing the harmful industries, it's like massively different amounts here. So another important piece of the puzzle in terms of journalism or aspects that would very usefully be covered is looking at kind of conservation, climate finance in the context of the broader kind of financing system in a particular country or between countries, if it's a kind of bilateral approach. So I'll put my own country on blast, Canada. If we have, for example, the overseas development assistance is dedicating X number of tens of millions of dollars for conservation on the one hand, hopefully a really positive thing. But on the other hand, if they're directly subsidizing to the tune of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars per year, fossil fuel industries, mining companies, including in countries where they're funding conservation work, we have to look at that and say, I mean, how does this make sense? This is insane. So again, the kind of looking at it in context is really important. It's not in isolation. It's often very closely tied to broader agendas of international relations, geopolitics, and so on. But especially even just looking at the numbers, I don't know how governments can look at these numbers and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. The huge discrepancies between the amount of funding that governments and private philanthropists are investing in conservation and climate action versus how much is actually being subsidizing the direct the industries that are directly contributing to the planetary crises. And then again, if you look at something like debt for nature swaps or otherwise, I think we can look back to prior decades' experience with things like structural adjustment programs. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund have tried to leverage quite systems level policies and political agendas for certain aims and so on. It ended up devastating national economies and self-determination in that sense within those countries, and creating huge dependencies on overseas investments and huge discrepancies in power imbalances and so on. Multinational enterprises just coming and extracting, and nothing, the resources are extracted and the wealth is extracted as well, going back to specific countries that are hosting those multinational enterprises and consuming the resources they're extracting. So I think we have to look at also that broader kind of global context of that history and the kind of global economic and financial / investment systems within which conservation philanthropy exists as well.
Thank you so much for that last point there, Holly. Yeah, I was actually wondering about that myself, about even if a fund is quote unquote successful and is doing what its purports it's doing, that larger context of zooming out and seeing how, like, that on the national level or on the global level, we continue to extract and exploit the resources of that country, or like how is that look in that context, I think is a really important question. So thank you so much for bringing that up. So I do have one question. I'm not sure how this was given to me by a friend. I'm not sure how to interpret it exactly. There's a couple of ways that this question could be read, I suppose. But the question was, how do you adequately interrogate the Western influence on the global South that comes with philanthropy? I kind of feel like, to a large extent, over the course of this hour and 15 minutes, you answered that a little bit. But is there any high-level thoughts you have on that question?
Could you just repeat that question, Mike? Sorry, I was trying to write it down.
Yeah, so the question was, how do you adequately interrogate the Western influence on the global South that comes with much philanthropy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it may take years of coverage and kind of exposure to how a region is shaped and what types of solutions or efforts they pursue, or simply a lot of deep reporting talking about, like, what were groups pursuing, what did they start to pursue as different. And then I say that as this long effort, but in a way I've, for instance, have been reporting on, in my case, climate philanthropy entering Africa writ large. And just in those conversations, you can kind of hear that there's just this classic, and it goes beyond any region, of nonprofits are forced by their nature to chase the money that comes in. And so when a large philanthropy enters the global South, enters a particular region, frequently that's like the Congo Basin and the Amazon region, there's others that are kind of these hotspots where a lot of money flows in, and whatever those institutions are pursuing becomes what groups in those areas pursue, because that's how they will be able to continue to pay their staff, etc. And to a certain extent, this happens in the US, in states, cities, everywhere. And so, like, trying to talk to the people to understand what the longer term trajectory of the civic society, of nonprofit ecosystem has been, will help you kind of see that influence and tease out what it was that Foundation X or this group of foundations was pursuing and how that impacted it. And yeah, I think there's also, you could pursue a positive side of this. There's capacity building that takes place. There's accounting structures and systemization that occurs. But so often this story of this type of philanthropy is one of an outsider based in one of these global North capitals, or even within a continent. Sometimes it's like 3 or 4 cities where all the international NGOs and funders have their foreign offices, and they dictate to other parts of that continent. And so kind of working out how that thread has pulled the whole society with it is, again, talking to people and trying to see where those efforts were focused prior to and would be otherwise in people.
Thanks for going first, Michael. It's a really interestingly phrased question. Yeah, I would say maybe, so how do you adequately interrogate the influence? Perhaps just really looking at the history of that particular funding. If it's a specific foundation, for example, really delve into where is their wealth coming from? On what industries is that wealth based, essentially? What kind of investments are they making in order to continue growing that wealth or using that wealth for philanthropy or other purposes? So I think a lot of the kind of historical side of things, what's the backward-looking legacy of that particular foundation or family, let's say, not just in terms of the mechanics of the funding itself or where the wealth is coming from, but also the ideologies and the value systems and the worldviews on which their philanthropy is based. So we touched on before fortress conservation, these very outdated notions of pristine wilderness, and conservation means excluding people, etc. That is just not the way the world works. That's not how conservation works in any way, shape, or form. But there are still a lot of family foundations and so on that really are predicated on that very outdated mindset and that image of the world and how the world works, etc. So I think interrogating those value systems, those worldviews that may be kind of baked into the DNA of a foundation or a philanthropy's approach would be really important as well to better understand then in turn, when they're making a decision about a particular grant or something to support, what is that based on? What's the whole history and worldview on which that is based? And that may give more of an indication of why it went in that direction. But then, even I think perhaps this kind of perceived dichotomy or binary between like West and global South, I don't think it's that clear, as in it's not that black and white either. You have, again, in my home country, Canada, you have many, many, many First Nations, Métis, Inuit organizations and so on, wide range of contexts in which they're living and pursuing support through different channels and so on. There's within the global South, quote unquote, there's also a lot of mega industries and mega wealthy individuals and families in India and so on and so forth that are kind of using the same playbook that a lot of countries in the so-called West have also been using for many decades. So I think maybe there's a need to also go beyond that kind of perceived binary of the West is doing this and the global South, so to speak, is doing this. Obviously, yes, there's centuries literally of certain major power imbalances and injustices there. But I think also in the current globalized context, it's not that straightforward. There's a lot of similar tendencies happening within a lot of countries in the so-called global South that also requires, similar levels of interrogation. And countries in the global North or the so-called West are not immune to those same issues that some people might think only exist in quote unquote global South around corruption, elite capture, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, maybe looking at more the issues as opposed to it being unique to a geography or a geopolitical block or something, that I don't know if those boundaries are really as straightforward as we might think sometimes.
Those are excellent answers to that question. Thank you both so much. Listen, that is quite a substantive discussion. I will definitely be reviewing this conversation for my own work. And I just want to say thank you to our panelists for joining us, Michael and Holly. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to listen to or watch other conversations in the Mongabay webinar series, we recommend following our live stream page on Mongabay's YouTube channel, where you can see past and future discussions. Or you can subscribe to Mongabay's webinar newsletter, where you can sign up to participate in these talks. That is linked here in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach. But you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet. Even just $1 per month makes a difference and does help offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, go to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find us on accounts such as LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.